Ok. Muy buenos días a todos. Solo unas breves notas en español. Ustedes saben que esta es una actividad que la vamos a realizar en inglés. Solo quería darle las gracias y la bienvenida nuevamente por acompañarnos en esta interesantísima actividad con el ex secretario del Homeland Security de Estados Unidos, Jen Johnson. Voy a introducir la actividad a quienes ya nos están acompañando y se están sumando en inglés para continuar en ese idioma la actividad. Good morning, everyone. I hope you are doing well with your families at home in this rainy day in Chile. For the Center for International Studies, it's a great pleasure to host the former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, Mr. Jen Johnson. Mr. Jen Johnson served in that position from 2013 to 2017. Johnson now practices law again in New York City at Paul Weiss, Wright-Field, Gordon, and Garrison. In private life, Secretary Johnson is also a regular commentator on NBC, CNN, ABC, Fox, and Bloomberg News. Prior to becoming Secretary of Homeland Security, Johnson was appointed by President Obama to be General Counsel of the Department of Defense and appointed by President Clinton to be General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force. Johnson is a graduate of Morehouse College and Columbia Law School and the recipient of 10 honorary degrees. This conversation will be moderated by Ambassador Joseph Westphal, who recently joined the Center for International Studies as an associate researcher. Ambassador Westphal is professor at Lauder Institute at Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, and he served as ambassador of the United States in Saudi Arabia. Also, he was Undersecretary of the Army. Ambassador Westphal and Secretary Johnson are longtime friends who served together in the governments of Clinton and Obama. After the conversation, we will have time for question and comment from the audience. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for sharing with us your thoughts about the current situation of the United States. And thank you, Joseph, for making possible this conversation. I hope our audience can enjoy this very insightful conversation. Joseph.
Muchas gracias, Jorge. Yo voy a practicar mi castellano un poquitito aquí, en agradecerte a ti, al Centro de Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad Católica de Chile. Y muy bienvenidos a todos ustedes. Muchas gracias por participar en esta conversación. Mr. Secretary, it's great to be with you again. Thank you for taking the time to do this. I think this is an important dialogue because what's happening in the United States has obviously big global implications, and we'll get to that a little bit later. I would begin, Mr. Secretary, by asking you a little bit about your background, and in that case, to suggest to our audience that you are a graduate. You got your undergraduate degree at Morehouse College in Atlanta, and your grandfather, Dr. Charles Johnson, was once president of Fisk University in Tennessee. Now, most people abroad don't know about this, but these two universities are what we call historically Black colleges in the United States. Mr. Secretary, can you help us frame what's going on today in the context of, once again, the struggle for battling racism and discrimination in our country, in the context of those historically Black colleges that you and your grandfather were part of?
Thank you very much for having me for this important discussion. Let me apologize that I must speak to you in English. I took 4 years of Spanish in high school and in college, and my grades were terrible. In fact, I think it's the case, never has someone who received so many C's and D's in high school attained so many honorary degrees, as Winston Churchill once put it. I am a graduate of Morehouse College from Atlanta, Georgia. It is the only all-male, all-Black school in the United States. If you can see me and you can see my background, if you look over my right shoulder, you will see a photograph, a black and white photograph of a gentleman by the name of Benjamin E. Mays. Benjamin Mays was the president of Morehouse College for decades, and he was the inspiration for all Morehouse graduates who graduated from Morehouse College anywhere in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and 1970s. I graduated from Morehouse College in 1979. The most famous graduate of Morehouse College was Martin Luther King, who graduated in 1948. Benjamin Mays was an inspiration to both of us. He spanned all those years. And in fact, Dr. Mays gave the eulogy at Martin Luther King's funeral. But Benjamin Mays is the guiding light for all Morehouse graduates for over 30 years. From my experience at Morehouse College, I would say that I obtained an understanding of Black history, Black culture in the United States. And I would say that from that experience, from the moment Barack Obama asked me in 2006 to help him become president, I knew I had to say yes. And I did, because I knew that I was being asked to take part in history. He was a new face on the national scene. He had just been elected to the US Senate. He had the audacity to run for president. And he was a long shot, but I recognized that this would be an historic event. And up until then, I never thought I would see the election of a Black president in my lifetime. In November 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president, and I became part of his administration, I think almost all Americans believed that the election of a Black man as president of the United States, given our legacy of slavery in this country, was a huge step forward toward what we refer to as a more perfect union in the United States. However, a Black president for 8 years, a Black Secretary of Homeland Security for 3 years, a Black Attorney General of the United States for 8 years cannot eradicate the racism that exists in the hearts and minds of many members of our nation's law enforcement community. That is something that will take much, much longer than 8 years. I've given a lot of TV interviews over the last 2.5 weeks about what happened in Minneapolis. And when I see the video of a representative of the nation's law enforcement with his knee on George Floyd's neck, the thing that comes to mind is the rally cry of the Black community over the last 6 years or so, that Black lives matter. And I could hear Black America saying to white America, do you see what we've been saying all these years? You see a member of our nation's law enforcement treating this man as if he were an animal, and the police officer was the hunter. And this one event has been the catalyst for demonstrations across our country in virtually every city. And we see across the globe in places like Germany, as far away as South Korea. People are tired of what has been happening, and they want change. I believe that change must come at the stage in which we recruit people to law enforcement. We're supposed to recruit people who are dedicated to protecting and serving the public. I fear that we have recruited far too many people who want to be the neighborhood bully, or as we say in the United States, the neighborhood badass, with racism in their hearts. And so we must take a hard look at recruitment practices for our police. But the most important point I'd like to make, that I have been making to domestic audiences here in the United States, is that what happened in Minneapolis was not a Black problem. It is an American problem. Equality before the law in our country means everything. And that is something that all Americans should care about. Equality before the law is as American as our flag. And change will only occur when all Americans decide that we must make that change. Back over to you, Joe.
Well, Mr. Secretary, one of the reasons I brought up the issue of historically Black colleges is that I was a professor in Oklahoma early in my career when I began as my academic life. And Oklahoma was the last state to desegregate its universities. That didn't happen till the mid-1960s, if you can imagine that. From the start of our history to the 1960s, Black students had to go to these specialized colleges because they didn't want to allow them to mix with. Now, when you look at
if I could add one point, Joe.
Yeah, sure.
What you said is true. For a long time, Black people in the United States could not go to white colleges. And so there was a whole group of Black colleges that stood up so that Black people could get a college education. Morehouse College, Spelman College for women, Fisk University, which you mentioned earlier, which my grandfather was president of, Howard University in Washington, D.C., Hampton Institute in Virginia. My parents wisely made the choice for me when I was going to college in 1975 that I should go to a Black college, even though I had a choice by 1975, because they wanted me to understand more about my own identity. And it was one of the smartest decisions my parents ever made for me. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, these have been for a long time very fine universities. But we could talk all day about why they even continue to exist today, but as such. But let me take you to what's going on in the streets of literally every community, even the small community outside Philadelphia where I am, where we've had demonstrations, 90% of them peaceful, or maybe 100% of them peaceful demonstrations, but have in some places like Chicago, New York, DC, resulted in violence at some times, usually in the night. I lived like you did during the 1960s with the anti-war demonstrations. I was in Washington at the time, the anti-war demonstrations, Vietnam, but also the riots that happened after the assassination of Martin Luther King. What do you see as the difference between what we're seeing today, of the people that are in the streets today, and the people that were in the streets in the 1960s?
It's a somewhat difficult comparison to make. In the 1960s, the rallying cry for Black America was, "We shall overcome. We shall overcome." And Lyndon Johnson made the famous address in March 1965 to a joint session of Congress for civil rights, where he literally embraced the phrase, "We shall overcome." Over the last 6 years, the rallying cry of Black America is Black Lives Matter. And I'll never forget, I saw a photograph of someone representing the Black Lives Matter movement, and she had a t-shirt on saying, "This is not your grandmother's civil rights movement. It's different. It's a different theme. It's a different generation. There's a different emphasis." But Martin Luther King said that in this country, we have the right to protest for rights. And he said that protest is a form of language for those who do not feel they have a voice in society. And so we've seen across this country many marches. I participated in 2 marches myself this past weekend here in my hometown of Montclair, New Jersey, which is just outside of New York City. So I guess that makes me a protester. They were peaceful marches organized by high students. So often, and this is something that is common to both the civil rights movement of the 60s and what we see today. So often marches, protests are organized by young people, students, high school students, college students who are demanding change. That was true in the 1960s and it's true now. The march I went to on Sunday was organized by 16, 17-year-olds, high school students. So that is very much something in common. But what we were demonstrating against in the 1960s were laws that prevented Black people from voting, laws that prevented integration, that required separate public accommodations, bathroom, restaurants, department stores, schools. So that's what we were fighting against. We were fighting for a change in law. Now it's for equality under the law, where there are far too many incidences of excessive force by our police departments at the local level directed toward Black people, whether it's a wrongful death, whether it's a shooting, whether it's police brutality. And so the grievance is very, very different.
Well, you mentioned the person with the T-shirt that said, "This is not your grandmother's." I forget what the statement was.
This is not your grandmother's civil rights movement.
Civil rights movement, and that's what I was trying to get to. Because when I participated in the demonstrations in the '60s, it was against the war in Vietnam, not civil rights. My generation was interested in that piece.
And you probably never thought then you'd become Undersecretary of the Army, right, Joe?
No, I did not.
Right.
But
the #2 civilian in the whole United States Army.
Right. But I tell you this, what I find amazing, and you said the demonstration you participated in was high school students. So this is what I was trying to draw out from you, is that when you look at these demonstrations all over the United States, and they're large and they're huge, there's as many white people marching, young people, mostly young people, in these demonstrations as there are people of color.
Right.
And that is very different in my view. We have a new generation. So I'm the grandfather. I'm 72 years old. I'm the grandfather. This is way beyond anything that I would have imagined.
Yes. So the marches I went to, I was heartened that there were probably an equal number of whites as there were Blacks. That's somewhat unique to the community that I live in. This is a very progressive community. It's very diverse. And so that I wasn't surprised to see so many of my white neighbors marching alongside me. But it's heartening because you see the majority race in this country who recognize the need for change and are also demanding change. And change will never occur unless the majority race recognizes that change has to occur.
No, I agree, but I also really believe that what is going to make this last beyond just these marches is the fervor of the young people in this country who don't see race the same way that my generation saw it.
Well, you and I have been disappointed, Joe, because after these mass shootings that we have in the United States, like Parkland and Sandy Hook, there was tremendous momentum for change organized by students.
That's true.
And I'm assuming the audience is aware of what I'm referring to, Parkland and Sandy Hook. These were mass shootings by a lone gunman who walked into a school, a public school in both those communities, and killed dozens of people. And there was huge clamor for more gun safety laws in our country after that. But because our national Congress is so paralyzed and so polarized, nothing happened. Yeah. And so what I've been saying is that if we want change in terms of police practices, we need to look to our mayors and our city councils, not our national Congress, for change. Because I'm afraid that if we left it to our national Congress, it would die.
So let me take you to that and to something you said earlier about policing. So what we saw here in the United States were peaceful demonstrations that had elements of violence, usually carried out at night with looting and all of that. Chile went through some of the same back in at the end of last year with large demonstrations for different reasons, really, but equality also was one of them regarding native populations in Chile. But it was mostly about economic inequality in the country. But there were peaceful demonstrations that also turned violent, with a lot of destruction of infrastructure. How do you see this, the future of how we manage this? You saw what the administration did. You saw the reaction of some people that we ought to have our military involved, that the police unions. I don't think that's a concept that a lot of other countries have. Can you talk a little bit about how you think we can actually address this issue in a way that perhaps we can fix it once and for all?
Okay. Big question. Three-part answer. First, you have to divide the nature of the protesters. Most protesters, in excess of 90%, are peaceful protesters, marchers. We saw early on after Minneapolis, some of the protests escalate into violence, either because the protesters were provoked or they were provoked by the police. Sometimes the police presence can be so large and provocative, it provokes a fight. And in a few instances across this country, we saw the protests escalate into violence. And the message there is simply that when a protest escalates into violence, it gives the upper hand to people on the other side of the debate. The protesters lose the moral high ground when the protest escalates into violence. We saw that in a few instances. And then there's a third category I'll refer to, which is just simply opportunistic looting by people who are on the streets during a protest, who don't even understand what they're there for, don't even know the name George Floyd, but would loot a store, say in the Lower East Side in New York City, which we saw about a week ago. For the most part, local law enforcement has been able to contain the violence that has broken out. It was contained by the local police, and in some instances, with the help of our state level National Guard. National Guard are sort of part-time military under the control of our state's governors. In very, very rare instances, the president has the authority to what we call federalize all the National Guard, to direct some sort of military presence here in the United States. That is contrary to how things should work and normally work in our country. We have laws against what we refer to in this country as a posse comitatus. As Ambassador Westphal knows, our military is in general not deployed on the streets of the United States. One of the reasons I believe we respect and revere our military so much in this country is because we keep it cabined to just overseas conflicts. We keep our military out of the business of domestic law enforcement, but in rare circumstances.
We have a law that prohibits it.
Yes, and for example, it is against the law for a member of the military in uniform to show up at a polling place, at a place where Americans are voting, so that Americans don't feel intimidated by the military, unless that military officer is there to vote himself. There are rare instances where the military can be deployed. The Insurrection Act of 1807, signed by Thomas Jefferson, permits that, but it basically permits it when all else has failed, when state government can no longer control a situation. And President Trump, who, and I don't mean to get political here, but I may sound it, has no sense of history. He obviously heard about the Insurrection Act of 1807 and threatened to invoke it, which provoked a huge fight. And even some of our most revered retired generals and admirals in this country objected to that because they understood that you don't deploy the military to the streets of the United States. Now, in terms of the answer to all of this, Joe, I'll go back to what I said before. I don't believe that we are doing a good enough job of recruiting the right kind of people to our nation's law enforcement. People who are dedicated to protecting and serving the public, not people who are there to bully the public. I also believe that the military needs to rededicate itself to what I refer to as de-escalation tactics. Sometimes police officers lose sight. They too have a temper, and tensions are raised in an encounter on the street, and they find themselves with a civilian in a chokehold, or with their knee on somebody's neck, like Minneapolis. In that circumstance, the police have to be trained to take a step back and say, why am I here? What got me into this? If it's a counterfeit $20 bill, maybe you need to take a step back and say, is this really worth it? Is this really a life and death situation? George Floyd, that whole thing was over a counterfeit $20 bill. Eric Garner, the chokehold on Eric Garner in New York City was over a package of cigarettes. So the police every once in a while need to learn to de-escalate a situation, calm down, and ask themselves, is it really worth it to set off the kind of reaction that we've seen across this country?
So a little bit of statistics.
That was a big answer, I'm sorry.
No, that's very good, but a little bit of statistics to this problem. In 2019, 1,098 people were killed by police in the United States. Over 1,000 people in 1 year were killed in 2019 by police in the United States. Black people constituted 24% of those that were killed, of the 1,000. But Black people constitute only 13% of the population. So
right.
Severely skewed against African Americans. Between 2013 and 2019, 99, so in that whole time period, 13 to 19, 99% of the killings by police, no officers were charged for the crime. That is, 99% of the officers that resulted in their killing someone were not charged with any kind of a crime. So today, given what you said, some people are saying we need to defund police departments or even dismantle them. What do you think about that?
Clearly, from the statistics you cited, there is a racial disparity in terms of incidents when the police use lethal force against a civilian. The police are more likely to use lethal force when they're confronted by a Black person versus a white person, clearly. So that's number one. One of the things that occurs to me when I see an incident like George Floyd or Eric Garner or some of the other recent cases that are captured on an iPhone camera. They're captured on an iPhone camera. Think about all the instances of police brutality, excessive force that are not captured on an iPhone camera, where somebody didn't happen to be standing there. Somebody asked, well, are incidents of racism in the police, brutality, excessive force on the rise? No, they're not. It's simply the instances of it being filmed are on the rise. And so this has been a perpetual problem. And Joe, what was the last part of your question? I'm sorry.
So I guess my question to you is are there some of the proposals to dismantle or
yes, right,
or defund police departments make any sense?
Right. So there's the rally cry now in a lot of protest is defund the police, defund the police. And I saw the signs last weekend and the march here. And, very often, there are two answers to that. Very often in a movement, you have the moderate elements of a movement, you have the more conservative elements of a movement, and then you have the more aggressive and radical elements of a movement that fall behind a rallying cry like defund the police or abolish ICE.
Which, by the way, if I can interrupt you, when you were secretary, you had the biggest sort of paramilitary force, the biggest group of law enforcement of anybody in the world under you.
Well, I don't know. The Chinese Ministry of Public Safety is pretty big. But I had the largest collection of federal law enforcement officers at any cabinet department. That is true. But so in any movement, you need, there will be an element, which I think is actually good, that has a more militant flavor to it that people are drawn to. So that was true of the civil rights movement in the 60s. On the one hand, you had the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is a more conservative organization. You had the Black Power movement. You had Malcolm X with a more militant wing of the movement. And then you had Martin Luther King in the center. And Dr. King, I believe, was most effective because he had conservative and more liberal wings of the movement that he could sort of counterbalance. So, a rally cry like defund the police is simple. It's two words. People understand it. They're drawn to it. But when you press people, what does that really mean? It's more nuanced, obviously. And what people mean, the more thoughtful people who use the phrase, it's not defund public safety entirely. We must always have public safety. We must always have an agency of our government that responds to crime and investigates crime. Otherwise, you'll have lawlessness in the streets. It means redirecting some of that money to social services, to other needs of a community. And so that's really what people are saying.
You think our police
it's a simple phrase, but it's really what people are saying.
You think our police are too militarized? When you see them, they look almost like soldiers on the street in terms of their equipment, their helmets, their trucks, and so on.
Well, you'll remember this, Joe. One of the lessons we learned from the incident in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 is that a lot of police departments across our country like to buy military style equipment from the Department of Defense that the Department of Defense doesn't need anymore, like a big armored Humvee.
Yeah.
But when you put that kind of military equipment on the streets of a city, it can be very provocative to people, be very confrontational. And so, as you'll recall, after Ferguson in 2014, we in the Obama administration decided that we would limit the sale of military style equipment to local police departments because we found it would be counterproductive and unnecessarily provocative to the very people that the police are supposed to be protecting and serving.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And in fact, I was involved in that because as the Undersecretary of the Army, I had to get rid of all this equipment, surplus equipment that we had in Afghanistan. And we had to give priority to our police departments. A
lot of police departments, they like these big toys. They like these big, powerful toys in case of a real bad situation, but it can be unnecessarily provocative.
Chile doesn't have a National Guard in the sense that, we're a federal system and the National Guard works for the governors rather than the president, unless he federalizes them, as presidents have done to send them to wars like in Iraq or Afghanistan. What do you think about the role of the National Guard in the context of what we've been talking about?
There are three phases of the National Guard. Phase one, the National Guard is like a part-time military in our country. Most of these people in their civilian lives are police officers, they're first responders, and they put on the uniform a certain number of days a year, and they work for governors to mostly respond to something like a hurricane or a natural disaster, to aid local first responders. Then there's the National Guard in what you and I know is Title 32 status, where the federal government agrees to pay for them, but they remain under the control of the state governors. And then, and this is the rarest situation, the president has the authority to federalize the National Guard and put them under his command and control, either to respond to something overseas because the active duty military needs to be supplemented, or in the very rare situation where they need to be deployed to the United States. The most prominent example in modern history was when President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard because the state of Arkansas was refusing to abide by a federal court order to desegregate its schools. And there was riots in the street, people were resisting. That was in your lifetime, Joe. You're older than me. That was the year I was born.
I remember that vividly. I remember watching it on a black and white TV set, and yeah, it was an amazing period of time for us. Let me close. We want to open it up to Q&A. Let me close with this particular question. As you said earlier, and I think really well said, and you've been the person quoted most on this, is this is not a uniquely black and white issue. This is an American issue. I think that's something like that you framed it. I think it's excellent. It's also not a uniquely American issue. If you look around the world, and Chile is no exception to this, you have countries that discriminate because of ethnic origin, because of race, because of they discriminate against religious populations, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and on and on. Everywhere in the world you have these kinds of issues. How do you see what's happening in the United States having a global impact beyond just what we've been talking about internally here?
Everyone sees what's happening in the United States because of our media, because of cable news. The world has real visibility into the domestic affairs of the United States. And there are minority groups, oppressed people, people of darker skin color in almost every corner of the globe. And so a civil rights movement, I did a debate at the Oxford Union, Joe, about maybe 2 years ago. And the debate was about the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. And I was struck by the fact that the civil rights movement in the United States sparked some of the very same type of events, sit-ins in the United Kingdom, because people in both countries could see what was happening in the other. So it's not a coincidence that we see marches in as far away as South Korea in reaction to what is happening here. You know, a lot of people in the United States were influenced by Tiananmen Square 30 years ago, 1989 in China. And so that's not an accident. As we all become linked through CNN, BBC, what have you, CNN International, where the world gets smaller and smaller.
Yeah, yeah.
As John F. Kennedy said, we all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future.
Yeah, and in England, they the demonstrations in England recently, I forget what city this was at, they toppled the statue of a man who had been the principal, I don't know what you'd call him, the guy who was the principal guy in shipping African slaves to the Americas. He owned all the ships, and they had a big statue to him. And generations of people in England live with that statue standing there. And we have the same issue now in the United States with statues of Columbus and statues of our Confederate generals. and our military bases named after them. So it's awakened, I think, a sense of how this issue permeates globally around the world.
Yes, it is very interesting. And we have this really interesting debate going on right now in this country about the fact that there are a lot of Army bases across the South named after Confederate generals who fought for the South during our Civil War. The head, the chief naval officer, chief of naval operations, and the commandant of the Marine Corps just ordered that all these Confederate flags should appear nowhere on a military base. And so and the Army is now trying to assess whether they should remove the names of Confederate generals off bases in the South, whether they should take down these statues you just referred to. And President Trump, in his normal heavy-handed way, says, no, I'm not even permitting the debate. And it is complicated. I made this point yesterday. A lot of people in our country they have the Confederate flag on the back of their trucks. They want to fly it in front of their house to celebrate their Southern heritage. And I have a Southern heritage too. This photograph that I hope you can see is of my great-great-grandmother, Julia Branch. She was born in 1850, a slave. And she was a slave, she was a teenage slave during the Civil War. And that flag to me represents the statement that my great-great-grandmother should have remained a slave her entire life. But fortunately, she did not. She won her freedom after the Civil War, and she's buried, interestingly enough. So the flag, that Confederate flag, is offensive to me because it represents the view that my great-great-grandmother it belongs to be a slave, should be a slave for the rest of her natural life. So the flag is offensive to me. It's personally offensive to me. On the other hand, and this is where it gets complicated. History is complicated, Joe. On the other hand, this woman is buried in an integrated cemetery in Lynchburg, Virginia, just a few feet away from Confederate soldiers. Do I believe she should be exhumed? Her body should be exhumed and taken to another place away from the Confederate soldiers? No. She's been buried there for 83 years, and she should continue to lay at rest in that place. George Washington, the founder of our country, was a slave owner from Virginia. Do I believe that we should change the name of our nation's capital because of that? No. Do I believe we should take his face off the dollar bill? No. I have first cousins named Washington. Do I believe my first cousins should change their name? No. They're proud of their name. They're not changing their name. So a lot of what we want to erase is also so interwoven into our history that it would be impossible to eradicate it all. Okay. I'm done.
Well, we could talk about that much longer, but let's give the folks that have joined us an opportunity to ask you some questions. And at this point, let me thank you again for being here, and let me turn it over to Jorge. Jorge, you on?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your insightful conversation with Ambassador Westphal. We will be starting with the question and comments. And first, the Minister of Interior, Gonzalo Blumer, would like to ask you something. Minister?
Hola, Jorge.
Hola.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning.
Y saludo a todos los que nos están viendo y escuchando. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Secretary for sharing this moment with us in Chile. And I also like to thank al Centro de Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad Católica for letting me share thoughts and questions with Mr. Secretary and attendant to this meeting. It is especially interesting to have this conversation right now, while the US is experiencing such a particular moment, similar in many ways to what happened in Chile 8 months ago. This situation of massive protests and acts of violence raises many questions and discussions, but in particular, it is shown as a new phenomenon of security that requires rethinking our institutions at various levels. In Chile, due to these events, in addition to others from the past, we are faced with the necessity to propose a police reform, as it is now being debated in Minneapolis. On December last year, President Piñera commanded us and commanded me to conduct this reform, and we are currently working on different areas such as conduct control, efficiency, intelligence, and public safety, among others. In your speech in the Oxford Union in 2012, you said that your efforts were grounded in the rule of law, and you explicitly said that in this unconventional conflict, therefore, we apply conventional legal principles. Of course, our situations are completely different, but we do share the same effort to comply with the rule of law and to follow conventional principles. We do share the same belief that the monopoly of the use of physical force will only be legitimate as long as it is exercised in a lawful manner, and that is the main inspiration of our reform. One of the main issues of our current discussion from the technical point of view is the strengthening of our public security institutions and the way police are supervised. One of the models that we are studying is specifically the US Department of Homeland Security, which you lead for more than 3 years during the President Obama's administration. Therefore, I'd like to ask you what are the benefits and costs of the institutional model you adopted in 2000 and what would be your recommendation for this reform process we are going through? Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson.
Minister, thank you for that question. And thank you for joining our discussion in your busy schedule. The Department of Homeland Security was created in 2003 after the terrorist attack on our country on September 11, 2001. Frankly, the Department of Homeland Security was a political compromise. In many respects, our Congress, in creating the Department of Homeland Security, went too far and didn't go far enough. We should have, in my view, done a better job of creating a department that looks like many other governments' ministries of interior, perhaps like your own, where we have within one cabinet level department all of the federal law enforcement agencies that are part of the national government to be coordinated by one minister or one secretary. Instead, what we did to create the Department of Homeland Security is we consolidated into one cabinet level department all of the agencies of government that regulate all the different ways you can enter into our country, from land, sea, and air, and now cyberspace, on the belief that if you regulate all the different ways you can enter our country, you control terrorism. The motivating factor for the creation of the Department of Homeland Security was anti-terrorism. And the view was if you can regulate it from land, sea, and air, aviation security, maritime security, port security, border security, we control terrorism. But we left in the Department of Justice and many other departments a lot of other federal law enforcement agencies out there. So in that respect, we didn't go far enough. If I were king and I could recreate the structure of the federal government by decree without our Congress, I would create a Department of Public Safety, perhaps that looks like your ministry, that has every federal law enforcement agency within it. And I would deconflict all of their missions so there's no overlap, there's no inefficiency. And then I would leave all of the prosecutors in the Department of Justice, all the lawyers in the Department of Justice. So the Department of Homeland Security in the United States is the third largest department of our government with 22 different components, 240,000 people. But in many respects, we did not go far enough in consolidating all of the different agencies into one place.
Okay, thank you, Minister Gonzalo Blumel. Now is the turn of place of the Senator Jose Miguel Insulza. Can you hear us, Senator?
Now, I guess.
Okay.
I guess I can start my video now, right there. Well, thank you very much, Secretary Johnson, for being with us, and thanks also to Joseph Westphal. I'm very happy to see you again. You visited us at the Organization of American States a few years ago. I very much remember that. I also remember that you are a Chilean native. Ambassador Westphal was born in Chile, and we're very proud of all his achievements. I have two questions, actually. The first one has to do with this problem of violence in the police forces in the US, which, as I must say, I agree, much stronger against the African American population, but it also exists all throughout any kind of activity that you develop that goes in problem with the police. I very much remember in May 1970, I was studying there at the University of Michigan, and we went to see there was a rally for the massacre of Kent State. And I remember me and my wife, who was expecting a baby, were very impressed about the violence of the police against those students. I mean, they were basically white students, I must say, and they were protesting peacefully for a crime that had been committed against the students. And they were so violently repressed that every time you see this, and I see this, I think, why does this happen? I mean, why is police trained that way? And my impression is that it has to do with the fact that police are trained to deal with a population that can always have a gun in their hands. So how linked is this problem of police violence with the fact that with the Second Amendment and the possibility of all Americans to carry guns everywhere? There are 100 million Americans, I understand, that own guns and own several guns. So my first comment would be that what's the relationship of this kind of action of the police forces with the fact that the guns are so prevailing in the hands of civilians in the U.S. My second question has to do with the second group that is also very much an object of discrimination, very strong discrimination in the U.S., which is the Latino population. Latino population is today the largest majority in the U.S. between the legal and illegal. There are so many illegals that you have to count them, and when it's estimated that they are the largest population. And however, we have a very low political participation by the Latinos and a very low attention by the government. And this was not very different, I must admit, during the past government, in which the issue of the people who are born, who are immigrated to the U.S. when they're very young, and they have never been regularized, is still pending, and it's pending in spite of the fact that there was a Democrat-held Congress in the two branches of Congress some years of the Obama administration. So what can be done with the Latino population? What's the possibility of having this issue solved? And how much of that racism is also taking place against another community, which are the Latinos? Thank you very much for the two questions, Joe. I'm sorry, probably too many, but very happy to have you here. It's we really have the opportunity to find somebody who was so active in government very few years, and an issue that is very important in Chile. I must admit that we have suffered some of the problems that the minister mentioned, and the problems that Joseph also mentioned in our country too, with a mixture of peaceful protest and fair and just protest and violence, and we are very interested in knowing your experiences about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question, Senator. Those two questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, of course.
Okay, the signal is a little weak.
Mhm.
So in response to your first question, one incident like a Kent State or Minneapolis or New York City can overwhelm a situation, and we forget all of the other situations where there's a protest or a march and there's no violence. So the march that I attended last weekend here in Montclair, New Jersey, the only police presence I saw were police officers on the street, blocking the streets, protecting the marchers. There was no confrontation of any type. And the answer to your question goes back to what I said earlier, which was that law enforcement needs to learn how to de-escalate and not let their tension, not let tensions rise to the point where they receive or they take an impulsive act, like with Kent State. Police officers are human also, but they have the upper hand in these confrontations, and they need to learn how to de-escalate a situation and not act impulsively, as some of them do. I used to say to the law enforcement officers under my command, don't let one incident overwhelm all the good work you do in a community, because it will. One bad incident of a migrant being hurt during an enforcement and removal operation to deport somebody that receives a lot of attention can undermine all of the work that our immigration personnel do in a community, such that they can't do their jobs at all. And I used to say that to our immigration enforcement personnel all the time. On the question of immigration, most Americans, even under Donald Trump, believe that undocumented immigrants who are here in this country, who have been here for a long time, should be treated fairly and be given a chance to get on the books, work on the books, pay taxes, become accountable, and possibly even have a path to citizenship in this country. There are an estimated 11 or 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Over half of them, according to the data I saw, over half have been here more than 10 years. They are de facto Americans. And most Americans believe, therefore, that they should be given a chance to be accountable. On the other hand, Americans want border security. The two seem to be in conflict, but they're really not. But most Americans want border security. We don't want open borders. We don't want people to just be able to cross under any circumstances. And so in our prior administration, we worked toward comprehensive immigration reform, where we would take care of both and a lot of things in between. More border security, because the Republicans insisted upon it, and taking care of the people who were here, like, for example, the DACA kids, because Democrats wanted that. And we were working toward a good bipartisan compromise legislation as recently as 6 years ago. But immigration in this country, as I'm sure you know, has become so politically polarized and paralyzed that nothing gets done anymore. And this president's focus is all just on border security and deporting as many people as he can. Ironically, up until this year, there was more illegal immigration across our southern border under Donald Trump's first 3 years in office than there were the last 3 years I was in office. There's more illegal immigration under President Trump. And there have been fewer deportations, actually. Over.
Thank you, Senator Insulza. Now,
Jorge, just one thing.
okay.
I was asking if some of the police violence doesn't have to do a lot with the fact that they are more prone than any other police to face guns on the other side. I mean, so many citizens carrying guns probably provoke a violence from the police.
Excuse me. Interesting you should say that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Interesting you should say that. There are some states in the United States that permit open carry, where people can carry their guns in the open. And we had a demonstration recently, I think in the state of Michigan, where people came to demonstrate against the laws that required us to stay indoors because of COVID. And they were carrying their weapons openly.
In the legislature.
In the legislature. And there was no violence. There was no provocation. Many people have suggested that it was because they were all white and not black. And that if they had been black, carrying guns openly, marching on the state capitol, it would have been a much more provocative situation. That is my comment to the senator's question.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator. Now, Patricio Navia, can you hear us to ask your question or your comment? Patricio? Okay. Darío Paya, can you hear us to ask the question?
Yes,
Okay.
I hear
Good.
you.
Thank you, Darío.
Thanks, Jorge. Good to see you again, Ambassador Westphal. And thanks, Secretary Johnson, for your valuable time and insights. I have, I guess, a different question in the context of highly polarized events here in the US, wherever. We hear more and more as an explanation that the algorithms driving social media platforms are tweaked in such a way that we're exposed whenever an argument's going on. It's either something that it's part of our own echo chamber or coming from the other end of whatever the argument is, and everything else in between gets filtered out. So that these platforms, Twitter, what have you, either automatically fuel the fire or can be exploited to fuel the fire by people and interests, foreign or domestic, whatever language they speak, who don't necessarily have a horse in the race. They don't care about which side wins the fight as long as there is a fight. They're invested in the fight. And some people from there jump to other rabbit holes, like, you know, Besmenov, what was it? The Russian defectors explaining the role of demoralization in the process of subversion, blah, 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 blah. So in seeing some of the eerie similarities between what you have gone through in the last couple of weeks and what we went through at the end of last year, in terms of the quickness and how the fight covers all the territory that it's available in no time. I wanted to ask you, what can you share with us? What do you know about whether this is true or false? And if it's true, what can generally be done to deal with it in a democratic context? And if it's false, of course, ignore the question and jump immediately to the next one. Don't waste any time on it. Thanks for your time, Secretary.
It is true. I agree with the premise of your question. And the way Americans, and I'll make this comment about America. I am not in a position to comment about the situation in Chile, but I can talk about America, United States. The way Americans receive their news now, it's in a very segregated, compartmentalized way. When Ambassador Westphal and I were growing up, we received our news from maybe 5 or 6 basic sources: ABC, CBS, NBC, the local newspaper, and the local radio station. And those news organizations all have standards. And so Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, we all got our information from the same sources, and we could form our opinions about the Vietnam War, about the civil rights movement, about who should be the next president based upon the same information, the same set of facts. Now, Americans can go to so many different places for their so-called news that what we are doing, and even I fall into this trap, what we are doing is we go to the places that reaffirm our own biases, our own prejudices, our own inclinations. So if you believe Donald Trump is a bad president, there's a cable news channel that is dedicated to talking about what a bad president Donald Trump is all day long. And there's another cable news channel that is dedicated to defending everything Donald Trump does all day long. And they have a lot of viewers. And so people go to news sources now, and because of the internet, it's free and open. Anybody with a keyboard can, get on the internet and claim they're putting out news with no standards. And so you can go to places that simply reaffirm your biases, and we become very compartmentalized in this country about how we receive our news, some of which is forgive me, complete bullshit. And it is how, at one point, something like 40% of Republicans believed that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. And I saw a recent poll of Republicans that said 83% of them believe that Donald Trump is a better president than Abraham Lincoln. Because we're going to these compartmentalized sources for our information that are biased, that are not objective. And it's true on the liberal side and the conservative side. And it has led to an increased polarization in our politics. Now, what is the answer? In a free and open and democratic society that guarantees the right of free speech, that guarantees the right of a free press, the government should not be in the business of trying to regulate speech, except when there is a foreign influence like the Russian government that is trying to influence an election. The government should not be in the business of trying to regulate speech. Think of what some government authorities could do if they could ban something because they deemed it to be fake news. I believe that the answer lies with social media providers, internet service providers. They need to do a better job, in my view, of regulating the content of things they permit on their platforms that violate their own terms of usage. And frankly, I believe Americans, the public, the consuming public, needs to do a better job of being skeptical about the information that they see and consume. We all need to do a better job of asking ourselves, hey, can that really be true? Because we're now, as we surf the internet, we're much more superficial in consuming news alerts, a news item. We just read the first paragraph without taking the time to really be skeptical about what it is we're consuming. And so I believe that has to be the answer. Government should not be in the business of regulating speech, in my judgment.
Could I just add one point, Dario, to what you also pointed out? We're about to go through a presidential election in the United States, where this kind of information is going to be very, very critical because literally everybody's on social media. And what you have is, for example, the fear that the Russians are going to tamper with our elections, and they have in the past done that.
It's not just a fear; they are still.
They are, and they're
active now.
Right, and they use very creative ways in which we can't even tell that what they're putting out there is false. It looks so legitimate. So it's a big problem.
confirm then. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. We have the last question, Joseph, Ambassador Westphal, is from Cristian Valenzuela. He's an academic, a professor of the law school in Chile. Cristian, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, it's an honor to meet you and a great conference so far. How do you perceive this crisis is going to influence, as Joseph was talking about, the outcome of the upcoming election in November? Especially you as a Democrat, how do you see this issue and the divide affecting your nation regarding the most moderate partisans and the most radical people, all in the right or in the left in the US? So do you think this issue is going to grow, is going to get deeper, or you think this is going to go away and you're going to go to normal elections, understanding that we are going out from a pandemic and going out from very complex issues in the economic and social matters? Thank you very much.
My honest answer is I don't know. In response to recent events, President Trump's approval ratings have gone down dramatically. Joe Biden has a very significant lead in the polls, but I've seen this movie before. 4 years ago at this time, Hillary Clinton had a significant lead in the polls against Donald Trump. In politics in our country, a month is a year. The only polls that I will pay attention to will be polls just before the election in November. And the way our system works, we have the Electoral College. The popular vote does not matter. We have a system where winners can lose and losers can win. You can win the popular vote, but lose the Electoral College and lose the election. That's what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton got 66 million votes. Donald Trump got about 63 million votes. And so what will matter are the polls just before the election, which is 6 months away, in the swing states, the so-called swing states. And in 2020, that will be Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Predicting the outcome of the election now is a little like trying to predict the stock price of a public company 6 months from now. It depends upon a lot of events that will happen between now and then. In our country, a month is a year in politics.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Cristian. Joseph, if you wanted to the closing remarks.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Jorge, y gracias a todos los que participaron en el seminario. And of course, thanks to Jay Johnson. I think this type of seminar is very important, and it brings our leaders who have served in multiple ways our country to connect with your leaders, academic leaders, political leaders, and students and citizens in a way that's really important. So I want to thank you, Jorge, and thank the Center for do this. And I hope that we can continue to do these kinds of seminars more often, even if they have to torture you in English. It's I think very important. Mr. Secretary, let me give you the last word. We got just a minute or two, and I again thank you for taking the time to do this.
You know, it's interesting. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with this organization, with this group of distinguished people that I've spoken with. I hope we can have more of this type of conversation. It's interesting, a month ago, I said in politics, a month is a year. A month ago, I never would have predicted that I'd have a discussion like this for over an hour, and we barely talked about COVID-19, because there's been an intervening event that has changed everything. But thank you for conducting this session in English for my benefit. And I hope that in the course of the discussion, I have said something about my experience and affairs in our country, the United States, that has in some way resonated with you, that will be beneficial to you in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Johnson, Ambassador Westphal. The idea, as you said, is to continue holding this kind of conversation, this kind of debate. For our audience and for Chile, it's quite interesting to learn more about the current situation in the United States, and especially given that the fact you have elections in November. So thank you again for taking the time, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Ambassador Westphal. Because of you, we are organizing, or we made possible this conversation.
I see your children participated in this as well.
In the end, yes, right. Thank you. Y
Thank you.
buenos días a todos, que tengan muy buen día. Bye bye.